Good afternoon, and you're very welcome. It's great to see all of you. It's great to see a church where I know everybody in the church. Two quick announcements about the Mass. We will be saying the Gloria, and if you pick up the red book, on the inside front cover, you will find the words to the Gloria if you would like to use that. Secondly, since we're celebrating the Sunday of the Holy Trinity, it's the traditional day when the brothers renewed their vows, a pious renewal of vows. And therefore, after the homily, I will come up here and invite the brothers to stand, and I will lead us in our renewal of vows. Thank you. Let us now stand and sing the opening hymn.
It's providential that we're here to celebrate Brother George's Golden Jubilee today of all days. Months ago, when Brother George was looking for tentative dates for the calendar here, today was the only date when there was not a wedding or any other event. This is providential because today is the vigil of Trinity Sunday, and Trinity Sunday, for hundreds of years, is the day when the Christian brothers make and renew their vows. This tradition goes all the way back to 1694. Brother George, in his book, To Touch Hearts, describes it. In the first decades of the founding of the Brothers of the Christian Schools, St. John Baptist de La Salle and some of his first community felt inspired to give their lives in a total way to God for the education of the poor. So de La Salle brought 12 of the senior brothers together at Pentecost to discuss this momentous step. After much prayer and preparation, on Trinity Sunday in that year 1694, the 12 brothers and de La Salle did it. They made formal, perpetual vows to God for life as brothers of the Christian schools. The text of their vows formula has been used ever since. After this homily, all the brothers will stand, and with Brother George, they will renew their vows together. Now, on June 26th here, there will be a Mass to honor all this year's jubilarians. I smile here because Brother George advised me not to read out a list of all the jubilarians. However, I would like to mention the names of the brothers who live here at Mont La Salle, who have been very good to me and to us Carmelites. Making their vows, their Golden Jubilee this year, Brother Donald Johansson, Brother Ricardo Palacio, and Brother Thomas Westberg. 60 years this year, Brother Richard Orona. 65 years this year, Brother Richard Morato. And 70 years this year, Brother Armando Garcia. All these Christian brothers renewing their vows here, and each of us in our individual calling in the church. We know that the offering that we made to God way back then needs renewing today and every day. Love can never remain the same. We all must keep on giving ourselves to God day after day after day. De La Salle wrote in one of his meditations, and it's as fresh for me as if he had written it just for us today. He wrote, "You offered yourselves to God. You offered yourselves to God when you left the world. Did you hold back any of yourselves at that time? Did you give yourselves entirely to Him? You should not be content to have made this offering of yourself to God once. You should renew this offering every day." One of my favorite sentences in de La Salle's writings applies to all of us again here today, no matter who we are. Ah, how good it is to give oneself to God. Ah, how good it is to give oneself to God. And we can do this because, as St. Paul says in our second reading, the love of God is being poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit. It's not easy to be a Christian brother. It's not easy to be a Christian today. St. Paul said in our readings from about a month ago, it's necessary for us to undergo many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. And Jesus says in the gospel today, I have much more to tell you, but you cannot bear it now. We live in a very difficult, a very crucial time in our lives. I don't have to tell you to stand up and to be counted for the church, for our country, and for one another. Just as St. John Baptist de La Salle wanted to stand up and make perpetual vows with 12 of his first brothers, each of us needs to renew our own respective commitment to God for the church, for our country, and for one another. When the temperature rises, so to speak, in the church and in this chapel, we need each other to live out our vocation of love with generosity and, yes, even with a smile. We need each other. We support each other. We witness to one another. We love one another. We give our life to God for one another. In March, when I spoke with Brother George about this day, he spoke with much gratitude about all the people in his life who have inspired him in his vocation. He said, I have been lifted up by so many people in my life. I've been able to do things in this vocation that I never could have imagined. In my Jubilee, I'm celebrating all the people who have blessed me in my life. This began in his family, and some of his family are here with us today. Then, when he was just 15, he came here to the juniorate. He wanted me to give special thanks to Brother Stanislaus Campbell, who taught him so many years ago and who has always been an example to him. Brother George also wanted me to thank the Provincialate community here, who are so supportive of him now. This afternoon, we've all climbed to the top of this mountain to thank God for Brother George, but also for all the Christian brothers. In conclusion, there is one person who wishes he could be with us today, but his health has been not so good recently. I mean Pope Francis. 3 weeks ago exactly, on May 21st, at the conclusion of the 46th General Chapter of the Brothers of Christian Schools in Rome, all the delegates went to the Vatican and had an audience with Pope Francis. Brother George was there. In the back of your program, you'll see a picture of Brother George with the Pope. Pope Francis told them, as a brother, I want to remind you, be a witness, that you may be brothers not only in name, but in fact. And may your schools be Christian, not in name, but in fact. Thank you for what you are and what you do. Thank you. Brother George and all of you brothers, to all of you here, let's let Pope Francis have the last word. Thank you for what you are and what you do. Thank you.
Most Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, prostrate with the most profound respect before your infinite and adorable majesty, I consecrate myself entirely to you to procure your glory as far as I shall be able, and as you will require of me. For this purpose, I, Brother George Van Grieken, promise and vow to unite myself and to remain in society with the brothers of the Christian schools who are associated to conduct, together and by association, schools for the service of the poor, to go wherever I may be sent, and to do whatever I shall be assigned, either by the body of the society or by its superiors. Wherefore, I promise and vow association for the service of the poor through education, stability in the Institute, obedience, chastity, and poverty, in accordance with the bull of approbation and the rule of the Institute. I promise to keep these vows faithfully all my life. As we begin this part of our festivities, I've asked my brother Leo to lead us in prayer, and then Father Jason says he wants to do a blessing, and then we will have an explanation of the food, of how we will get our food. Okay? So Leo?
Thank you, George. Oh, Heavenly Father, we thank you for allowing all of us to gather here this evening for the celebration of George's 50th anniversary. We ask that you nourish our bodies with the food that's been prepared for us. We thank you for bringing us up here safely, allowing us to mingle with many friends, new and old. And we ask that you watch over us the rest of the day and bring us safely back to our homes. And for those of us that have pets, to also watch over our pets. In your precious name we pray.
Amen. Thank you, Leo. Thank you.
Let us pray. Loving, gracious God, we ask your blessing upon our dear brother George as he celebrates this golden anniversary. Lord, we give you thanks for his willingness to say yes to you, to all of us as well. We give you thanks for his friendship and for his journey with us throughout these many years. Bless him, give him good health. Allow him always to see the love that surrounds him. We ask all this in your son's blessed name. Amen.
Amen.
Well, good evening. For those of you I did not have a chance to meet in person, I'm Brother Mark Murphy. I'm connected with the Salle Christian Brothers Foundation, and I'm honored that Brother George asked me if I would act as MC for this part of the program. George and I have known one another for more years than I wish to count, only because of the number, not because of George. But we've had wonderful adventures together, and I say this most sincerely, George. I have great admiration, respect, affection, and really wonder at the ways in which you have taken God-given talents and used them for the purpose of your vocation. You've been a wonderful, wonderful example to all of us and a source of encouragement. So I'm honored to be up here and helping with emceeing. George gave me permission to tell one story. And while I am Irish of descent, and Father Donald, that wasn't meant to be a slur or anything, that was just and I do tend to exaggerate sometimes. I want you to know that the story I'm about to tell you is really, actually, factually true. All stories are true, of course, but this one's also factual. This has to do with Brother George's PhD. He was a provincial at the time, and the council and all of the usual procedures, we had approved Brother George to go back to Boston College and study for an MA under Thomas Groome, which all of us really understood and knew how fortunate it was that he would be the one that George would study under. He still is a well-known scholar and wonderful person for religious education. So George goes back. He's there for a while. About 6 months later, I get a phone call, and it's from Thomas Groome. And I said, "Oh, Professor Groome, I'm shocked and pleased, and thank you for calling." He went on, he's also Irish, you know, Groome. He went on and on telling me how incredible Brother George Van Grieken was as a student. And I thought, boy, this is really something, this kind of a rendition from a man like Thomas Groome. And so I was really impressed. And I said, well, thank you very much. He says, now, brother, I have something I want to tell you. He should be doing a PhD. I thought, oh, that's why the phone call. Okay. Yeah, okay, I get it. I said, well, Mr. Groome, you know, we have procedures, we have personnel plan, we have a lot of that is all thought through a little bit at a distance, and Brother George is scheduled to come back. Well, Mark, I work with a lot of congregations, he says, and I'm telling you, the Boston College will pay for everything. I said, oh, Mr. Goom, you remember Groucho Marx? Remember how the duck used to come down when you said the magic words? I said, I think we can handle the personnel question. But he was absolutely serious. George was so impressive, so good, that Boston College took care of all the expenses related to his PhD. So that's one indication of George's and it's a great example of our tradition, the brothers' tradition, about relying on providence, because God is never outdone in terms of generosity. And George's way of being brother, really, a number of these kinds of providential acts. I could go on, but I won't. My job is to introduce people and present to you some of the speakers that George has asked to say a few words. Our first one is Mr. Gary Short, AFSC. And Mr. Thomas Brady is also with us this evening. AFSC means they are affiliated members of the Institute. They're affiliated brothers of the Christian schools. And so Mr. Short was for many, many years our Director of Education. I could tell you lots of interesting stories about Mr. Short, and Father Lendace over there is starting to smile already, but I won't do that. Mr. Short made an incredible contribution to how we went about implementing our desire that brothers and LaSallian partners, all those who work with us, share the mission with same responsibilities. Everything from the spirituality to the care of the young, to the ways in which we have a concern, a special concern, for opportunities for the poor. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Gary Short, who will be our first speaker about Brother George. Brother George is also an expert on technology.
So this is a good occasion to thank people like Diego and Tony who've been moving umbrellas and making things really nice for us.
Yes, brother. I used to work for him. You're doing really well. Can everyone hear me okay? So I started working for Dell's Institute in the Office of Education in 1985, and that meant I knew George almost from that period, 1985 to today. So 35 years or so. So I feel like of his 50 years, I've been in pretty good contact with him, and so I have a lot to share. There's a lot of material that I could share about George, so I'm going to try to keep it somewhat simple and limited, right, George? Okay. So thanks again, George, for the honor to speak today. So recently I went to George's office and I asked him, so what would you like me to say, George? Is there anything you want me to emphasize during this talk? And he said, just offer your personal perspective, tell, be more personal about your relationship with me. So this is what I'm going to try to do. And I'm going to try as a personal perspective. I was thinking another way to describe this is what I love, what I admire about Brother George. Okay, and I suspect what I'm going to say to you will resonate with your own experience of Brother George. Okay. So I have three characteristics that I'm going to three categories of areas I want to emphasize. The first is his extraordinary talent. And I'm going to kind of place all of these talents together. As a writer, as an editor, resource center director, technology wizard, and his attention to detail. I want to offer a couple highlights of this extraordinary talent that I suspect many of you know. The first was several years ago. Brother Mark already mentioned he was at Boston College working on his, became his doctorate. So several years ago, he was at Delson Institute, and he was packing up some things. I said, "Where are you going, George?" He says, "I'm going up to a Benedictine monastery for 6 weeks to write my dissertation." And I'm thinking, yeah, right. Someone's going to go for 6 weeks and write a dissertation. Well, he came back, and he said, I got about 80% of it finished. And he finished his dissertation in about a few months, which we all know that often takes people a year or years to write a dissertation. He was extraordinarily quick and efficient, and you see this. The second example I want to use is this book, which I suspect many of you have seen. It's called The Teacher's Saint. George wrote it. It was published in 2019. It's been used by high school students and college students across the United States. Thousands of copies of this biography of De La Salle, very accessible book. It's been translated into French, into Spanish, and, well, did you tell us to me, George? Italian. And it's in process of being translated into Tamil, Arabic, and Portuguese. So he went out of his way to make this little book, Biography of De La Salle, very accessible to people. So thank you, George, for your attention. And the last example of his writing is when he was at the General Chapter the last few months. For some of you may have seen it, he called it Lasallian Ruminations. So every night from 10 p.m. to midnight, he wrote his reflections on what happened at the General Chapter. So when most of the brothers were going to sleep, George was busy writing, and every day he published in his blog his ruminations. And I said, so mainly he was thinking, for those people who couldn't attend the General Chapter in Rome, they'd be able to read about what happened. Well, he tells me the other day that actually a lot of brothers at the General Chapter were reading to find out what happened. So if you get a chance to read, if you haven't read it, there's 2 sections of his blog, several pages. So imagine him late at night writing these. The first section I'd recommend you read is the description of the election of the Superior General, and the details went back and forth of the process of that taking place. And the second is when they went to see the Pope. They went to the Vatican. George has this incredible detail about walking in the hallway, seeing the Swiss Guard, and meeting the Pope. And anyway, it's probably 6 or 8 pages of detail of that process. By the way, in typical George style, he's turned in his Lasallian Ruminations into a book. Within 2 weeks, he came home and turned it into a book that's called The 46th General Chapter, A Personal Perspective. It soon will be available on Amazon. 211 pages with pictures. The second category of his extraordinary talent is him as an editor. The first example I want to share is this little book called Let Us Remember. Some of you see it, Stories of the Holy Presence of God. It's 52 reflections by teachers, educators from around the world. They're only 2 to 3 pages each on how they've experienced the presence of God with students and in relationships in the schools with Lasallian educators. I know Brother Mark and I have used it with faculty workshops and with boards, pulled out a few of his reflections. It's a gem, George, so thank you for doing that. The second example of his editing, again, at Delson Institute, around the copy room, I said to George, George, someone should compile a list or pull together the letters, pastoral letters of Brother John Johnston and Brother Albero, the superior generals. They were terrific writers and very insightful. So, I just dropped that on him, right? A couple months later, he's in the copy room. I said, "What are you doing, George?" He says, "I'm printing out those letters that you mentioned to me." So again, it's an example of George picking up an idea and efficiently just doing it. One more example of his editing, which is pretty bizarre in my mind. George served as the editor and coordinator of this book, which just came out Monday. It was called St. John Baptist de La Salle, A Mystic in Action. He was involved in coordinating the translation of this book, 650 pages, in French, from French to English. And I said to George, "Well, do you know French, George?" He says, "No, it wasn't necessary." Undaunted, he led the coordination of this book and development of it as the editor. So congratulations, George. Another new release from Brother George Van Grieken. Oh yeah, it's for sale for $44.95, by the way. Okay, I also want to mention him as a technology wizard. I don't know if many of you know this, but George created the first website for the Brothers and La Salle schools in the United States in 1997, 25 years ago. He also beat Rome and all other La Salle institutions around the world by claiming the IP address delasalle.org. So if you wonder why Rome doesn't have delasalle.org, George has it, and it's part of the district, is delasalle.org. He did tell me, he says, I offered it to Rome, and they had already established it as lasalle.org. So that's why the District of San Francisco, New Orleans, has delasalle.org, George Van Grieken. We also, as a technology wizard, you've seen some of his work in the Resource Center. It's just been incredible. Brother Donald had the wisdom to ask him to be the director of this La Salle Resource Center here at Mont La Salle. And a few years later, Rome saw his work here and asked him if he could develop an international La Salle Resource Center. So that's why he's spending half his time now in Rome and half the time more or less here. And one of his projects is to create a digital library, whatever that means. All right, George? So be on the lookout for that. He also, this technology wizard, George, he also built a TV studio over here. It was like, okay, I got to do some interviews. I wanted to make it easy for people to make presentations. So George just built a TV studio. I'm sure his work at Christian Brothers High School kind of set the stage for it. As it suggests, George is a workhorse. But one of the other things that is key to this category of talent is his attention to detail and his accuracy. If you read anything that George has written or produced, you'll see it's grammatically correct. There's no issues around spelling. So he's extraordinarily accurate and detailed. His presentations of materials are just really beautiful. So I'll tell you a quick story. We are often, as members of the Office of Education, are asked to give tours of this place. And one time there was a group of new board members here at the conference center. And typically, after the first or second night, someone's asked if we could get a tour of the property. So one of my jobs was to do that. And George says, can I come along? And I said, sure, George. So I'm walking down this corridor here, and usually the first question is, or the first thought is, how big is this place? And I said, it's about 400 acres. And George, I hear George in the background go, 338. So when was this place built? I said, in the early 30s. He said, we moved in 1932. So I was like, okay, George, next time you lead the tour, and I'll follow you. So his attention is, anyway, extraordinary. Of course, come to find out, George produced this booklet, if some of you may have seen it. What a place. It's a description of this place, Mont La Salle. He doesn't take credit for it, but he is the author. If you've been here and you see this brochure around, it's George who created this. Okay, my second characteristic of George. So in this interview I had with George a few weeks ago, I asked him, how would you describe your vocation? And he said, well, I see myself as an explorer, an adventurer. I like to try different things. Sometimes they work and sometimes they don't work. So immediately I thought of George the Traveler. So I would like to kind of ask for a show of hands, how many of you have traveled or met up with Brother George, say outside of the Bay Area? Just raise your hand. Okay. Can I hear some places where you've met Brother George? Just yell them out.
Philippines.
New York City.
University of Notre Dame.
Hawaii. Disney. Okay, I've lost my place now. Okay, so I went through Brother George's curriculum vitae, and in it is a list of different places where he's made presentations and retreats. And so these are the countries where George has presented, or the Philippines several times, Australia, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Thailand, Vietnam, Italy, France, Ireland. When he was president of St. Joseph's Institute International in Singapore, he also said, While I was there, I went on my way to visit Hong Kong and India and Japan. He studied for 6 weeks in Guatemala. He rode his recumbent bike with Cecilia and her husband across the United States for several weeks. He walked part of the Camino in Spain. But you need to know that when George does things like travel, he's just not a normal traveler. I went to Australia with him once, and then the second time, he went back a second time, and I asked him how it went. He said, well, I had an adventure. He walked across the Sydney Bridge. Now, this isn't like walking across the pathway of the Golden Gate Bridge. This is, you could belay yourself. It's like walking on the tubes of the Golden Gate Bridge to the top of it. So it's a really extraordinary. He also, in that same visit, he went to Cairns. Well, Cairns is called the gateway to, what's it called? Gateway to the Great Barrier Reef. He went snorkeling there. And if any of you saw him when he came home, he probably stayed in the water a little bit too long with his head down because the back of his legs were pretty toasted. Okay. But typical George, he's not just going to. So the other day I asked him, have you ever been to Africa? He says, no, I haven't been to Africa and I haven't been to South America. And I could see his mind racing. He says, you know, when I was at the general chapter, the visitor from Africa asked me if I'd consider coming to Africa. So stay tuned. Wait till his next Christmas card. You'll probably see him in Africa, right? All right. His message to me about traveling, he says, I'd like to go where I'm needed. And I have to admit, I think he also just likes plain adventuring. And maybe it's related to his growing up in Holland and as an 11-year-old coming over to the United States and just getting comfortable being outside his environment. Okay, the last characteristic I want to mention is, so this last one is perhaps the most important characteristic of George for me, and it's George as friend, helper, servant, and brother. As many of you know, George is kind, he's quickly available to help, he's a good conversationalist. No project is too big or too small. If you need something done, you can go to George and he'll be there to help you out. I know he's the go-to brother for your family, George, as for your 2 younger brothers and 2 older sisters. And he's also the go-to brother for many of us. You know, if we need a family program, a funeral program, George, can you help me out by putting a funeral program together? I know Jimmy, he helped you get into Stanford by writing a letter and making some good contacts. So George is just this good guy who's willing to help out and be a brother to us. He likes to be present to people. For you at Christian Brothers High School, know that for several years when he was at Christian Brothers, every day he stood out in front of the school and greeted the students every morning, just to be present to them and make sure that they were welcome at Christian Brothers. So in conclusion, George, and I'm going to direct this to you, on behalf of all of us here who've benefited from your generosity and your vocation, I want to thank you. Thank you for putting your talent to the service of all of us. Thank you for your spirit of adventure, your creativity, your hard work, and your many kindnesses. Most importantly, thank you for being a brother to us. We love you, George.
Thank you, Mr. Short. That was wonderful. Our second speaker, I made reference in introducing Gary to the program we've had going in the district here and district of San Francisco, New Orleans, of really sharing responsibility for the mission, brothers and our LaSallian colleagues together, sharing all those parts of it and modeling what it means to be complementary. From the vocation of marriage and parenthood to the single life, as well as, of course, to the ordained ministry, with us, the brothers. Cecilia Powers is a long-term, wonderful relationship for George, going back to his days in Sacramento, which have a very special place in his heart. And Cecilia and her husband, Tony, have been an integral part of his own growth and development. one of the most interesting parts is the ways in which education takes place, not just in the classroom, but in a lot of other places. It was Cecilia and Tony that trained George for the bike trip he took across the country. And Cecilia in particular was very, very instrumental in making sure he was ready for that trip. So it's my honor and pleasure to represent and to you, Cecilia Powers.
I'm a little shorter than Gary. Well, I think you will see some overlap between some of what Gary has to say about George and what I will share tonight. It's a real honor to be here, and when George asked me to speak and mentioned that Gary and Brother Robert Wickman would be the other two speakers, I knew I needed to take my responsibilities very seriously. And then his next advice was, brief is best. And I thought, really, George? There is so much that one could say about George, and when I considered this talk, I realized that Gary and Brother Robert are far more qualified to talk about George as brother, George as teacher, George as colleague, as scholar, and as editor, and many of those things that Gary mentioned earlier. I feel enormously blessed tonight to simply speak about George as my friend. In reviewing our years of friendship, I determined that I've known George about 25 years, so about half of what we're here celebrating tonight. We got to know each other initially, I think, in the summer of 1997, which was the first LaSallian Leadership Institute. Is that right, Gary? 97, just about, somewhere in there. And then 2 years later, in 99, George came to work at Christian Brothers High School in Sacramento, which was my home at the time. And of course, George was the director of the community. When I first got to know George, in addition to being a man of great scholarship and faith, I found him to always be welcoming, always be positive, and always be up for that adventure that Gary mentioned earlier. In his days as director in Sacramento, George opened the community as often as possible to his lay partners. And there were lovely gatherings of camaraderie and friendship, wine, and moments of prayer and retreat, and all of those things that were so important to George to open that community and make it a place where everyone was welcome and felt at home. For many of us LaSallian partners, he truly did personify the core principles and was a shining example of a brother's life. Sometime in that first year or so of George living in Sacramento, he learned that my husband Tony and I are fairly avid cyclists. George came out to our home in Folsom with his bike, and we enjoyed many leisurely and some not so leisurely warm weekend rides together, followed by a cold beer and a meal. Tony did lots of bike maintenance while George stood by handing off tools, and they became fast friends, both interested in pretty much everything. Frequently, we would muse about possible future adventures together on our bikes in Holland, his dear homeland. And I really loved that my friend George was bridging my professional and personal life. So fast forward a year or two and our oldest son is born. The bike rides continue with a baby in a burley cart behind us, and George gets a close-up glimpse into our little family. And in anticipation of that cross-country spoken word ride in the summer of 2001, we spent that spring doing long training rides up and down the American River. And when the 1st of June rolled around, together with Greg Copra, we loaded up George's minivan. And I said earlier, I'm not really sure why George had the minivan. Tony and I didn't have the minivan. And we loaded up George's minivan with our 3 bikes, the burley cart, our 1-year-old son Mark in the car seat, and the 4 adults off for the 600-mile road trip to Portland. Full of many twists and turns, that adventure may have been his first and last road trip with a 1-year-old. Over the course of the next several years, we added 3 more sons to our family, and George kept coming out to Folsom for bike rides, dinner, and those endless conversations about everything and a lot of nothing at all. George learned to rock babies, and he got down on the ground and played trains with little boys. Bike rides began to include stops at the park, adventures at the lake, visits to the zoo, and endless games with a ball, any kind of ball. And as the boys got older and technology advanced, and of course George always had the latest technology, he was a rock star because he would show up with iPhones and games and things that we did not have in our house. So our children would immediately say, "Where's your phone? Where's your phone? And what game is on there?" Flappy Birds and Flying Pigs and whatever. George got to know each one of those boys and came to appreciate their different personalities and exactly what made each of them tick. When George left Sacramento and moved to Mont La Salle, the visits were less frequent, but that made them more special. And several times he had us up here for a swim in the pool, a hike around the grounds, to share a meal, and most importantly, to show the kids where Brother George lives. We refer warmly to him as Uncle Brother George, and occasionally as Grandpa, as someone once mistook him. As the kids got a little older, they began to understand more what George's life as a brother was all about, and he became a role model for a life well lived and as a man of great faith and commitment. Completely unprompted, our son Luke in the 8th grade asked George to be his confirmation sponsor, and then 3 years later, his younger brother Joe asked him as well. As George moved to Singapore and back to Napa and now back and forth to Rome, he has remained steadfast in his friendship with me and my family. Our boys are now 22 through 15, and George can tell you the various traits of each one of them. For the last several years, for Christmas, and sometimes just for no special reason, packages will arrive in the mail from George, and he has sent each one of those boys a book selected especially for them and who they are. Sports writing anthologies for our budding journalist, science fiction for the quiet introvert, adventures for the free-spirited one, and the last one who isn't much of a reader. George is trying to change that for me. He has managed to find illustrated novels to try and draw him in. All the while becoming a family friend, George remained my friend and LaSallian confidant. We shared several years on the district mission council together and had parallel experiences as board members at different schools. We still very much value one another's experience and opinion. I know you all can identify when I say George is quick to ask thoughtful questions, to listen closely to your reply, and to always make you feel that your opinion is valuable. It is indeed my honor to celebrate our friend, Brother George, tonight. Not many of us do anything for 50 years, let alone be a brother. So indeed, it is to be celebrated. His dedication to the faith and to the mission of De La Salle and the brothers worldwide is admirable and an outstanding example for all of us. So please join me, and I didn't bring my glass, but I would like to toast my friend, Uncle Brother George. May you continue to be young at heart. May you continue to lead by your example of faith and hospitality. May your adventurous spirit grow and flourish, and may we one day ride the roads of Holland together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. As Cecilia was talking and as Gary was talking, I couldn't help but think in my head about how the rule characterizes our purpose. The rule says the purpose of this institute is to provide a human and Christian education to the young, especially the poor. We've seen tonight the real demonstration of the first part of that, and that's very, very purposeful. The human and Christian education of the poor. And the relationships that George has cultivated, it's been a wonderful, wonderful way to become an educator. To complete George's vocation, we have Brother Robert Wickman. Brother Robert also is a pretty unusual person, especially among the brothers. There's a tendency, perhaps, among some to identify themselves pretty much with the district they happen to belong to. that happen to have been born geographically in a particular area and spend most of their career there. Brother Robert is one of those wonderful persons who broke the boundaries. Brother Robert did not stay in just his own district. He made incredible contributions to this district in the ways in which he came and served, came as a consultant, came as a principal, came as a teacher. And the beginning of the relationship with Brother George started in Boston when they were students together. It's blossomed since then, and we've all been the beneficiaries. So, Brother Robert, we welcome you and appreciate your presence.
What Mark didn't mention was that he was responsible, along with Brother Ronald Rogenbeck, for me coming out here to a little school in Concord. George, I am delighted to speak for a few minutes today about you, my friend and brother. Today we celebrate 50 years of your fidelity to the Brothers' vocation and the Lasallian mission that have been the themes of a life well lived. The same phrase Cecilia used, a life well lived. I first heard of George around 1989 when I was living in Boston and he was preparing to move there to begin doctoral studies, well, what became doctoral studies at Boston College, where I was a graduate student while also serving as the principal of a Catholic high school nearby. George's first call to me went something like this. Hello, Brother Robert. I am Brother George Van Grieken. I understand you will be at the Youth Conference in November. Might I get some time with you there to discuss living together when I begin my studies at BC? Actually, George referred to me several times during the conversation as Ricky. I was curious about that. He said that others referred to me with that name. After some discussion, it was clear that George heard Ricky when the name being used by others was Wiki, a nickname I have had on the East Coast since I was in high school. Having settled that confusion, we discussed living in Boston together. The end result was several wonderful years living near Boston College, close enough so we could hear the undergraduates drinking on Thursday and Friday nights. Living near Boston College with 3 members of the Oblates of Mary Immaculate. A third brother, Richard Hurley, he joined us as well. Over the years, I have felt very fortunate to have George as a good friend. We share some of the same academic curiosity, while at the same time pursuing different interests. What we have always shared is an abiding friendship, a mutual regard for each other, and many, many opportunities for laughter. In these short remarks, I will now propose to you the top 10 insights I have developed about George over the years. This is not a roast, this is a testimonial. That surprises some of you. Here are the top 10 insights. Number 10, George has a severe case of curiosity. He has a wonderful way of asking questions about a variety of topics, especially those that interest his conversation partner. Number 9, George has a special gift for putting a positive spin on someone's characterization of people and events. He seems to be allergic to saying anything cross about another person or a current situation. Number 8, George does an interesting thing with thinking and communicating. He told me once that he thinks in Dutch, and what comes out of his mouth is English. This seems to explain in part why he searches with precision for the right language to use in discussion or exposition. Number 7, George will think nothing of stopping what he is doing and landing on what another person needs. That could be advice, solutions of a technological kind that elude mere mortals like me, or changing schedules to allow for an unanticipated event, especially one of a social nature. Number 6, George is loyal to church and institute. Not in any robotic or unthinking way. He sees the history, the traditions, the stories, the challenges, and the graces that come with such connections. And he is enthusiastic to keep them as critical points of development for who he is in this life. Church and institute are his North Stars, and they account for the servant leadership direction of his life. His commitment to prayer and spiritual growth both guide and challenge him on the journey of life. Number 5, I don't think George would call himself a scholar, despite the evidence we saw tonight. He sees himself, I think, more as a synthesizer of the knowledge and wisdom of others. That humility opens spaces for others to engage with him, and they end up learning much, especially from the work he has done over many years regarding our Lasallian heritage. Number 4, George keeps in touch with folks. Wherever he has lived, in various places in the United States and internationally, he has maintained a great capacity to stay connected. Those he has taught, worked alongside, and shared confidences with know of his reliability, rootedness in friendship, and high capacity for compassion. Number 3, George has a deep love of family. He has often spoken to me with affection of those who share his bloodline. Number 2, George loves this place that we gather in today. Mont La Salle is in many ways his mothership. I have learned over the years that it is a place of renewal, rest, and engagement for him. As a native of New York City, he has taught me that there's more to life than pavement, crowding, and subways. And number 1, and finally, the preeminent insight I have about George is this: what you see is what you get. His honesty, lack of excessive ego, and care for others are the signposts for me of a life well lived. Thank you, George, for who you are, how you serve, and the wonderful friendship we have. I know the many gathered here today could speak volumes of how you have been there for them, just as you have been for me. And I'll end with that great Latin phrase, ad multos amas.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much to the three of you, to Gary, to Cecilia, and to Robert. Some of you may know that in the church's process for canonization, there usually is included a person designated as the devil's advocate. And that person is supposed to show that side of the person being considered for canonization where there's a few questions about maybe were they really that good. Unfortunately, I could not find anyone to be the devil's advocate tonight. Oh. Yeah, so we're at that point where we're going to listen and have words of wisdom from George. I promised him, looking at the crowd here, I'd say about half of you would remember vaudeville. And in the acts of vaudeville, there was always the hook. If the actor out on the stage went too long, there was somebody backstage that had a long hook. They'd get him right around the neck and yuck, right off the stage. We don't have that tonight. George has full reign to say what is really in his heart and to tell us what it's been like for 50 years. God bless you, George.
I'm really glad that I'm not dead. Because it sounded like sometimes like eulogies. I prepared some remarks simply to keep it limited because I know our time is precious and you've listened to a number of people talk already and my voice isn't that great anyway, right now. But I will first just want to say thank you for your gift of being here today. Because I treasure knowing you, speaking with you, and just being with you. This won't be a long talk, I promise. Most talks of this kind are too long, too self-referential, and too easily forgotten. Let me just share with you a couple of things that I've learned after 50 years as a brother, which, by the way, was the best decision I've ever made, and one that I've never regretted. Indeed, it is a vocation that I've appreciated more and more as the years pass by, as I hope happens with your own vocation. This was a vocation that was seeded by my parents, who set off in their early 40s to a whole new life in a new country with 5 kids, and me as an 11-year-old who didn't know a word of English. They both, I found out later, had themselves thought about joining religious life. It was a vocation that was nurtured by getting to know the Carmelite priests as a young altar server here at St. Apollinaris in Napa. Because of their grounded spirituality and sense of humor, something stuck. And it's a vocation nurtured by the Sisters of Mercy in the grade school, their generosity, their professionalism, their joy at being educators and religious at the same time. I don't think I thought about it that way at the time, but when I think back, that really impacted me. The most significant of them was Sister Mary Ligori. America, remember? Sister Mary Ligori, Mary Corcoran. She pretty much taught me English when I arrived in the 5th grade, and again taught me in the 8th grade. And just a few days ago, I received a very nice card from her from Ireland, where she's retired currently. This is a side note, but my dad invited her without me knowing, when I graduated from St. Mary's College. And Sister Mary Corcoran was there, and she really appreciated being there. And it was a vocation realized during my years at Justin High School, where I came to know brothers like Brother Stan, who's here with us this evening. Brother Stan has been my friend and mentor for more than 50 years. Then the juniorate, the novitiate, and beyond were like a widening river, an ever deeper current that carried me into a life adventure that I'd never imagined could be this rich, this diverse, and this extensive. If you want an exciting life, there's nothing like a life that is the kind of religious life I've had. De La Salle wrote that a person who abandons himself to the providence of God is like a sailor who puts out to sea without sails or oars. This has also been my story. And the tide of providence is not yet finished with any of us, as I'm continually finding out. What I've learned along the way was well said by an Irish spiritual writer that I recently discovered. His name is Daniel O'Leary. I don't know if anybody's read him. Daniel O'Leary. He wrote that a divine healing power is moving within each of us and within all of creation. A short quote from his last book expresses it well. I really like this. Billions of years ago, an invisible dot of nothingness exploded into everything that is, the infinite cosmos of each tiny heart, the eternal heart of each expanding cosmos. And we somehow knew that it was the unfolding of a love story. We sensed that the Big Bang was the sound of love, and that creation, once molten rock, would one day sing operas. And on planet Earth, 14 billion years later, another invisible dot of love exploded in a human womb to create and develop a new order of that one being, of that one living love story. I very much like the connection between the Big Bang and the explosive potential of humanity as a vehicle of love's power. O'Leary describes us as the evolving, incarnate, invincible, visceral embodiment of the love energy of God. This is the beating heart of the universe. It describes what it means to be a person, what it means to have personal relationships, the mysterious richness of who we are with and for one another. Okay, perhaps all that's a little bit heady, but boy, it sure lights my imagination and appreciation of my life and the life of each one of you here. The relationships that we have are sacred things, living things. If you stop and really think about it, there is no dimension of a person, of the person and the personal that is deeply, simply, there is a dimension that's deeply, simply, and profoundly sacred. Another writer who I like very much is Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. He says the same thing, even better. He has a gift for making complicated things simple based on his long and deep scholarship of the Hebrew Scriptures and of Jewish history. You have to listen to this carefully because it's simple, but it's really profound. Faith, he says, is the belief in the objective reality of the personal. Faith is the belief in the objective reality of the personal. There will always be things, he writes, that science cannot explain. The beauty of Mozart, the power of a Shakespearean sonnet, the courage of Lincoln, the point of a joke, the tenderness of love between mother and child. These are worlds brought into being by the freedom of the human spirit. They are things communicated through speech, through music, through humor, through art. In such settings, in which I would include this evening's celebration, in such settings, our personhood meets other persons and forms relationships of understanding and trust. He summarizes it in this way, one little sentence. It is here in the mystery and majesty of the person that God lives. It is here in the mystery and the majesty of the person that God lives. What a wonderful thought and conviction that is. I very much believe and try to live this vocation as a brother from that kind of place, from the conviction that whatever we mean by God, by life, by love, are all facets of the same vibrant living reality. A reality that we live within and that we live out each day as persons. God, life, and love pervade the universe, permeate the moments of our lives, and shine out in each person we meet and each circumstance or invitation that we encounter, whether they be difficult or easy. It was certainly true of our founder, St. John Baptist de La Salle, and it's our experience today. With every decision we make and every action we take, the universe changes just a little, like a drop of dye in a glass of clear water. And the future changes accordingly, for good and for ill. And of course, for me and for other Christians, it is Jesus Christ who rests in the center of that mystery of the personal, and who holds the key to what relationships can and should be. Thank you for politely tolerating that little reflection. It's what I think about these days. But let me also thank you for your presence here this evening, for your kindnesses to me over the years. And I thought about, this isn't in my notes, but I really thought of this before coming here. I really want to thank the women in my life. because they have been such a blessing as a brother. They've been such a blessing on so many levels. They're really an important part of a full life. And I want to thank all those who made this evening possible. The food that was provided, Juan and the kitchen staff, they're not here anymore, but they did a great job with the non-moving food truck. And thank you to Patrick and his Hawaiian cuisine. Patrick is full of talent. I've known him for many, many years, and he's a top Hawaiian musician, and he and his family is with how many of your sons? Patrick and sons, is it the two?
One real one.
One real But he's got some terrific music out there. Look it up. And for the wine that we enjoyed, thanks to Alan and Brent for choosing them, and to Rand, who couldn't stay, for supporting their acquisition. For the unique setup and organization of things, thank you for the conference center and the maintenance staff, and for those of my family who took care of many of the details, to Jennifer and Rachel. And finally, a global thanks to, of course, anybody that I might have forgotten. I'll end with a short, powerful quote that I like very much. I like quotations, as you found out. But this one's really good. It's from an old and dear friend who passed away in 2015. Brother Robert and I came to know him in the early 1990s when he was a priest in Boston. And I was doing my graduate work at Boston College. We all lived together in that house, the Oblates of Mary Immaculate House, near Boston College. And he remained our good friend as he first became a bishop, Yakima, Washington, Oregon, then the Archbishop of Chicago, and eventually a cardinal in Rome. Bob and I tagging along for each installation like members of the family. Francis George was a brilliant, personable, focused, and even genuinely holy person. His polio was a mere inconvenience and a sign of humility. He was an amazing man to know. He took time with each person he met, looked them in the eye, and gave them his full attention. There's a picture in that little booklet that you have of him. Just, I ran into him, he's looking, he gave full attention to whatever he was talking about too. Toward the end of his life of cancer, he said something that I made into a small sign that today hangs in my office. The statement is also about recognizing God's presence in the personal. This is what it says. What we take with us from this life into the next are simply the relationships. Everything else disappears, but they are eternal. What we take with us from this life into the next are simply the relationships. Everything else disappears, but they are eternal. That's both hopeful and wonderful, that the relationships that we have now are ones that we can expect to fully live beyond this present life. The statement is very reassuring. It's also a challenge and an invitation to value our relationships, to see them as holy, as bearers of God's presence, and as marks of God's love for us right now and right here. And it's exactly this that I value in you. Thank you for being God's presence in my life. In that spirit, I would like to give each of you a small memento of this evening. Don't open it up, though. You know that I sometimes like to do things a little bit different, even quirky, exploring new options. And this little gift may qualify for that. I'll ask the servers to please give each person one box, but don't open it up yet. Don't touch it. Don't open it up. Well, we'll do all of that. Let's wait until everyone has one, and then we will open them up together. There are enough to go around, but just keep it in front of you right now. This is. I don't know how you guys were at Christmas time, but if you. when you see the bag and all that kind of thing. But just keep it in front of you. No need to shake it. You can. But it has to do with something. No, don't smell it, Chris. It has to do with what I've been talking about the importance of the personal, and how that, the older I get, how profoundly that means something to me. It's the kind of thing that happens if you're in the airport and you see somebody you know. There's something, connection that happens, or that is completely unlike anything else. And I've been in places, obscure places, where I've run into people that I know, and and it could be years later. I tell Bob every once in a while, like, Bob, I hadn't seen you since last year, right? But every time we get together, it's like with friends, right? You get good friends, you get together, and you just pick up where you were before, because that connection is there, that relationship is there, that combination of characteristics is there. And so it's something I think that's really important to value. And don't open up yet. When you see what's in the magic box, you will. I hope you will take it in the spirit in which it is meant. And it's a bit of a reminder of how important I value your relationship with me. And perhaps it'll help you remember the importance of relationships, especially of this one. So let me just say, yeah, just like keep going, because we're saying, when are they going to be done? But I'll just close. I'll do my closing, and then we'll go to the opening. That makes sense. Thanks for. I'm going to finish. I'll just finish this. Thanks for being part of the celebration. Of course, everything isn't over yet. There's plenty of wine left. There's plenty of lights left. There are beers left. There's the weather's fine. Stick around as long as you want. But you're probably done listening to people by now. And okay, does everybody have one? Who doesn't have one yet? Who doesn't have one yet? Robert and Julie, you don't have one yet. Okay. So go ahead and open it. Go ahead and open it and see what's inside. Is there a book? My niece asks. Yeah, I usually give out books. I give out books. But this is not a book. 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 You could put it in some obscure corner of your bookcase or behind the books. And every once in a while, if you want to get somebody to agree with you without saying anything, you could just hit the bobblehead. What's that? This is my watch. It's not an iWatch. No. It's a Withings watch. It's a Withings watch. So you're very welcome to it. If there are people who are not here that you knew were going to be here, or do you think would like one, I do have enough copies to give some extra ones out. So remember that. And I'm guessing this has got to show up on Facebook pretty quick. I guess, I don't know. But take it in the spirit in which it was given, which is I really want to be present to you, and quietly. Thank you. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the evening.